The blare of police sirens tore through the quiet morning in Riverbend. Yellow tape cordoned off the entire block, and dozens of neighbors stood behind the barricade, murmuring. In the middle of it all, Ethan Ward, a tall, bright construction laborer with cement dust clinging to his shirt, was in handcuffs, his face streaked with sweat and grit. A uniformed officer gripped his arm, steering him toward the squad car. "You're under arrest for property damage and endangering public safety." The detective's voice rang out. Ethan didn't resist. His left hand clenched tightly around a small, jagged brownish-gray stone, refusing to let it go since the moment they dragged him out of the site. A few workers shook their heads. Some whispered, "Guys lost it, tearing up the foundation like that, what the hell for?" But at the far end of the street, just a few hundred feet away, an industrial gas main was leaking invisible vapors into the storm drains, and only Ethan knew the rock in his hand was the key to stopping a catastrophe that could wipe out the entire neighborhood. The morning air in Riverbend was sharp enough to bite, the kind that stung your lungs when you breathed in too fast. Ethan Ward stood at the edge of the construction site, pulling his worn flannel tighter around his chest. The orange glow of sunrise bled across the rooftops, glinting off the steel skeletons of half-built storefronts. A cement mixer churned lazily somewhere near the loading area, the low groan of its drum vibrating through the ground. He had shown up 30 minutes early, not because he wanted to impress anyone. Experience had taught him that in construction, no one noticed unless you screwed up, but because he couldn't stand the silence of the small, rented room above the laundromat where he'd been sleeping. The constant hum of dryers had become a lullaby at night. But in the mornings, the emptiness pressed in too close. He spotted the foreman, Riley, near the equipment shed, clipboard in hand. Riley was in his mid-50s, with a face and a permanent squint, as if the world was just a bit too bright for him. He didn't wave Ethan over, didn't smile, just jerked his chin toward the far end of the lot where stacks of old masonry waited to be broken down. The work was simple, exhausting, and thankless, just how Ethan liked it. Swing the sledge, break the block, stack the pieces. By the time most of the crew arrived, he was already sweating through his shirt. This was his fourth job in 6 months. The pattern was always the same. He'd get hired on, keep his head down, and eventually something would happen. A supervisor with a grudge, a rumor from a past employer, and he'd be out again. But Riverbend was different. This wasn't just another job. It was a chance to plant roots, to maybe even rent a better place. The site itself was a maze of half-demolished walls, trenches, and the skeletons of future storefronts. The smell of diesel from the excavators mingled with the dusty scent of pulverized brick. Every few minutes, a crane creaked as it swung steel beams into place. It was chaos to an outsider, but to the crew, it was a kind of order. By mid-morning, Ethan had worked his way to the southeast corner of the site, where the ground sloped toward an alley lined with dumpsters and chain-link fences. He swung the sledgehammer down onto a chunk of concrete, the impact sending a satisfying shockwave up his arms. As the dust settled, a faint sound tickled at the edge of his hearing. It was a hiss, soft, almost delicate, but steady. Ethan froze, letting the sledgehammer hang at his side. He'd heard that sound before, years ago when he'd been working as a low-level assistant for a pipeline maintenance company. Back then, his job had been to fetch tools, check readings, and stay out of the way. But he'd never forgotten the first time a leak alarm had gone off. The techs running toward the noise, the smell of gas in the air, the awareness that one stray spark could send them all sky-high. Now kneeling in the dust, Ethan pressed his ear closer to the ground. The hiss was still there, faint but undeniable. He scanned the site. No one was paying attention to him. Most of the crew was on the other side of the lot. Unloading rebar, he used the tip of his glove to scrape away some of the loose dirt where the sound was strongest. His fingers brushed something cold and smooth metal. Clearing more of the soil, he uncovered a segment of pipe, thick and corroded, the kind used for high-capacity industrial gas lines decades ago. Faded yellow paint clung stubbornly to its surface, peeling like old skin. Yellow gas line. Ethan's pulse kicked up a notch. The city had replaced most of its older mains years back, but this one, buried under layers of construction, looked untouched since the day it had been laid. And if it was hissing, it wasn't dead. Just above the pipe was a chunk of concrete embedded with a jagged, mineral-streaked rock. He recognized it instantly. A safety marker, the kind inspectors once used to signal a line was secured and pressure-free. But the rock had shifted, almost loose enough to lift away. That meant the ground had moved. If the pipe was under pressure, any disruption could shear it open. Ethan leaned back on his heels, the noise of the site roaring back into focus. He glanced toward the welding rigs parked by the tool shed. According to the project schedule he'd glimpsed in the break room, in just a few days, the crew would be welding supports directly over this spot, and welding meant sparks. He forced himself to stand, brushing dust from his knees. His first instinct was to find Riley immediately, to tell someone, anyone who could shut this part of the site down. But another thought crept in, cold and bitter. What if they didn't believe him? On his last job, He'd flagged a cracked scaffold plank that could have killed someone. The foreman had called him paranoid and replaced him the following week. The official reason was poor attitude. He could already hear the words in Riley's gravelly voice. Those pipes have been dead for decades. Ward, you trying to slow us down? Still, this wasn't the kind of risk you could shrug off. He moved toward the office trailer, weaving between pallets of bricks and coils of electrical cable. The door was half open, and Riley sat behind the desk, flipping through a stack of invoices. Riley, Ethan began, stepping inside. The foreman didn't look up. Make it quick. There's a gas line in the southeast corner, Ethan said. I heard a leak. The old inspection marker's loose. We should, Riley sighed loudly, tossing the clipboard onto the desk. Those lines are shut off. City records say so. You've been here, what, a week? Don't start making problems. I'm telling you, it's active. If we're welding, over it, Ward, Riley's tone sharpened. Get back out there before I find someone who will. Ethan clenched his jaw, but said nothing. He stepped back into the sunlight, the weight of the conversation sitting heavy in his gut. That night, back in his cramped room, he couldn't sleep. He stared at the cracked ceiling, listening to the thump of laundry machines below. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that corroded pipe. He imagined a shower of sparks falling from a welding torch. The rush of ignition, the split second before the blast. He thought about the diner across the street, the gas ovens burning from dawn to midnight. He thought about the kids in the alley, behind the site, their laughter echoing between brick walls. No one else was going to take this seriously, and if no one else did, he'd have to. The next morning, the air carried the damp scent of an overnight drizzle, turning the dust at the Riverbend site into a thin layer of mud that clung to boots and tires. The sky was a mottled gray, with the sun struggling to break through. Ethan Ward stood by the tool rack, adjusting his gloves and scanning the layout of the site. Riley's voice cut through the air, assigning crews to different sections. Ethan was put on debris clearing along the eastern trench. On paper it wasn't anywhere near the southeast corner where he'd heard the hiss, but Ethan had a plan, one that involved a slow, deliberate drift back toward the danger zone without drawing attention. The sound from yesterday had been too clear, too sharp to be mistaken for a loose air compressor or leaking hose, and the sight of that yellow-painted pipe kept replaying in his head like an unwanted loop. He grabbed a flat shovel and wheelbarrow and started moving along the edge of the trench, scooping loose rubble into the barrow. Every few minutes, he'd adjust his path just a little farther south, blending the movement into the rhythm of his work. By the time the foreman passed by in a golf cart, barking at two younger workers for slacking, Ethan was already 20 feet from where he'd been assigned. No one noticed. When he reached the southeast corner, the noise of the main site felt distant, muted under the steady patter of drips from a nearby scaffolding tarp. The hiss was still there, faint but unmistakable, threading its way into his ears like a warning. He crouched down, scanning for any changes since yesterday. The soil here was slightly darker, holding moisture from the rain. He used the shovel to gently peel back a layer of earth. The metal of the pipe emerged again, its corroded surface glistening with dampness. The flaking yellow paint seemed even more brittle, curling away in spots to reveal raw steel, scarred with deep pits of rust. This close, he could feel something else's subtle vibration through the ground when he pressed his palm against the dirt near the pipe. It wasn't constant. It came in faint pulses, like the heartbeat of some sleeping animal deep underground. That wasn't good. Gas under pressure could create that tremor. He remembered one of the techs from his old job explaining it. If you can feel it, it's moving. If it's moving, it's alive. Above the pipe, the chunk of concrete with the mineral-streaked rock marker was even looser than he'd thought. A gentle nudge from his gloved fingers made it shift in place. The rock itself was about the size of a fist, its surface rough with streaks of brown, gray, and faint yellow. Years ago, someone had embedded it here to show the line had been checked and shut off. But it was a false comfort now, a relic from an inspection that had clearly been undone by time. Ethan's mind spun with possibilities. Maybe there'd been an earthquake years back. Maybe the soil had settled unevenly after other construction nearby. Either way, the pipe was no longer secure. He remembered yesterday's conversation with Riley. The dismissive tone, the way the foreman hadn't even bothered to check. It confirmed what Ethan had suspected. No one in charge wanted delays, not when deadlines and contracts were at stake. And if the crew hit this line while welding, he imagined the explosion. The sudden roar, the shockwave ripping through glass and brick. The people in the diner across the street wouldn't even have time to scream. Ethan knew he needed proof, something physical to back up his words. If this went to the city inspectors, without it, it would just be his word against a crew that didn't want trouble. He gripped the rock marker and twisted gently until it came free, leaving a jagged cavity in the slab. Dust and small stones crumbled away, exposing more of the pipe's corroded surface. Holding the rock in his hand, he felt a strange weight, not just in mass, but in meaning. This was evidence, however small. It told a story to anyone who understood what they were looking at. The problem was, no one on this site did. Or maybe they didn't want to. He slipped the rock into the deep pocket of his work pants, feeling it knock against his thigh with each movement. Then he replaced the loose dirt over the pipe, not to hide it from himself, but to buy time until he figured out the next step. The noise of approaching boots snapped him upright. Two of the other laborers, Mike and Torres, came around the corner pushing a cart stacked with plywood sheets. "Hey Ward," Mike called, "you're a long way from your trench." Ethan forced a casual shrug, cleaning up some of the mess from the rain. "You know how it gets down here." Torres grinned. Mess is Riley's favorite word for overtime. They kept moving, and Ethan exhaled slowly. If they'd seen the exposed pipe, the wrong kind of talk could start flying fast, and if word got to Riley, Ethan knew exactly how this would end. By mid-afternoon, Ethan had worked his way back to Ward, his assigned area. His mind wasn't on the rubble anymore. He was running scenarios. He could take the rock straight to the city's building department, but they'd want more than a story about a hiss and a chunk of concrete. Without visible damage or a formal inspection order, they might not even send someone out before the welding started, and the welding was scheduled for the day after tomorrow. He glanced at the pipe's location across the site, now partially hidden behind stacks of lumber and tarps. The hum of the machinery, the clang of steel, it all felt like background noise to the ticking clock in his head. If the foreman wouldn't stop work, and the city wouldn't act fast enough, then the only way to keep people safe might be to make sure no one could work near that pipe at all. That night, Ethan left the site with the rock still in his pocket. Rain was threatening again, the clouds heavy and low. He cut through the side streets, past the shuttered bakery, the hardware store, the faded laundromat awning. In the glow of a flickering street lamp, he pulled the rock out and turned it in his hand. The mineral streaks caught the light like veins of rusted gold. In his mind, he could still hear the hiss of the leak beneath the ground, steady and patient, waiting. This wasn't paranoia. This was real, and he had less than 48 hours to figure out how to stop a disaster. The sky over Riverbend was still ink-dark when Ethan arrived at the site the next morning. A thin layer of mist clung to the ground, curling around steel beams and pallets like slow-moving smoke. The only sound was the faint creak of scaffolding. Swaying in the pre-dawn breeze, he parked 2 blocks away, not wanting the foreman or anyone else to see him coming early. The crew wouldn't arrive for another 40 minutes. That gave him just enough time. Ethan slipped through a gap in the chain-link fence along the alley side, boots squelching in the damp earth. He moved with purpose, each step deliberate, toward the southeast corner. In the muted half-light, the tarps draped over stacks of lumber looked like shrouds. The hiss was waiting for him. Even before he crouched down, he could hear it, steady, patient, almost taunting. The sound seeped into the silence like a whisper meant only for him. He knelt and peeled back the dirt he'd replaced the day before. The corroded pipe greeted him like an old enemy. He pressed his palm to the earth above its. The faint tremor was still there. This wasn't just a minor leak. The pressure underneath could turn one careless spark into a chain reaction. Ethan's plan wasn't clean. It wasn't smart, either, not in the sense of staying out of trouble, but it was the only way he could think to force someone to pay attention. If he could damage the slab enough to make it impossible for the welding crew to work here, the project would have to pause. A pause meant inspection. And once the inspectors saw the condition of the pipe, they'd shut the whole area down. He wasn't thinking about his job anymore. He wasn't thinking about Riley's temper, or the way the crew might look at him afterward. He was thinking about the diner, about the kids playing stickball, about the neighbors who didn't know they were living above a loaded gun. He found the sledgehammer leaning against a stack of rebar. The handle was rough, the wood worn smooth. In the middle, from years of hands gripping it, he hefted it once, twice, feeling the weight settle into his shoulders. The first blow cracked through the early morning like a gunshot. Dust and small chunks of concrete flew, the impact vibrating through his arms. The sound felt almost obscene in the quiet. But he didn't stop. The second blow sent a spiderweb of fractures racing across the slab. Bits of gravel skittered across the ground. By the third strike, the slab began to sag slightly in the middle, revealing the jagged mouth of the cavity beneath. Ethan dropped to one knee and yanked another piece of concrete away, tossing it to the side. The corroded pipe was now fully visible, a mottled, rust-bitten length of metal that looked like it would crumble under too much pressure. He pulled the rock marker from his pocket and stared at it for a moment. It felt heavier today. This was no longer just a piece of evidence, it was a lifeline. The one thing that could prove he wasn't making this up. Voices. Ethan froze. They were faint, but growing louder. Boots on gravel, the metallic rattle of tools. He had less than a minute before the first crew members rounded the corner. He jammed the rock back into his pocket, gripped the sledgehammer again, and took one more swing at the slab. This time, the blow knocked a plate-sized section clean off, leaving the pipe bare to the damp air. The hiss seemed louder now, or maybe that was just his own blood roaring in his ears. Ward. Ethan turned. Riley stood about 20 feet away, a hard hat pushed back on his head, his face a mask of disbelief and anger. 2 supervisors flanked him, both holding clipboards, both staring at the gaping hole in the slab. What the hell do you think you're doing? Riley's voice cracked through the morning air. Ethan straightened, still holding the sledgehammer. That pipe is live. You weld here, you'll blow half the block. Riley stomped closer, his boots splashing through a shallow puddle. That's city property, Ward. You just destroyed part of a foundation we spent days setting up. You trying to tank the whole job? I'm trying to keep people alive, Ethan shot back. You ignored me when I told you about it. Now you can't. One of the supervisors muttered something to Riley, too low for Ethan to hear. Whatever it was, it made the foreman's jaw tighten. Drop the hammer, Riley said, stepping into Ethan's space. You're done here. Ethan hesitated, his grip tightening. He thought about swinging again, not at anyone, but at the slab, just to make sure no one could pretend the pipe wasn't there. But before he could decide, a sharp voice called from behind. Police, step away from the tool. 2 officers were moving quickly across the site, hands hovering near their belts. Ethan let the sledgehammer fall, the clang echoing in the mist. One officer took his arm while the other read the charges. Property damage, endangering public safety. The words felt surreal, like they were meant for someone else. As they cuffed him, Ethan's eyes went back to the pipe. In the weak morning light, the yellow paint seemed almost to glow. They started walking him toward the exit, past silent workers, who'd gathered to watch. Some shook their heads, others just stared. Ethan felt the rock in his pocket pressing into his thigh. He shifted his weight, making sure it stayed hidden. That was his card to play, the one thing that could force the truth into the open dot. As the officers guided him past the chain-link fence, he glanced back one last time. The welding rigs were being rolled into position. He had minutes, maybe less, before someone lit a torch over that leaking pipe. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into Ethan's wrists as the officers guided him toward the squad car. His boots scuffed against the wet gravel, and every step took him farther from the southeast corner, the one place he didn't want to live. A hiss was still in his head, echoing beneath the shouts of workers and the metallic clatter of tools. Behind him, Riley's voice cut through the fog. Get him off my sight. The foreman barked. One of the officers opened the back door of the cruiser. Ethan had one knee bent to climb inside when a vehicle's low hum broke through the noise. A white utility van pulled into the lot, tires crunching on gravel. The logo on the side, City Gas and Pipeline Authority, hit Ethan like a shot of adrenaline. A man in his early 50s stepped out, reflective vest half zipped over a navy work shirt. His face was weathered, with the wary eyes of someone who'd seen too many things go wrong underground. A gas detector swung lightly from a strap in his hand. The officer holding Ethan's arm looked over. You're late to the party. The inspector glanced around at the scene, the broken slab, the gathered workers, the cops, and his brow furrowed. We got an anonymous tip about a possible leak. This the spot. Ethan straightened, ignoring the pull of the cuffs. Southeast corner, under the old slab yellow pipe. It's live. The inspector studied him for a moment, then looked at Riley. You stop work in that area. Riley scoffed. The line's dead. Been dead for decades. This guy, he jabbed a thumb toward. Ethan decided to play demolition derby with my foundation. Then you won't mind if I check. The inspector knelt by the shattered concrete, flipping on the gas detector. It emitted a soft beep as the display lit up. He extended the probe toward the exposed pipe, moving slowly, the way a bomb tech might approach a suspicious package. Ethan held his breath. The detector beeped again, louder this time. Then the numbers on the screen jumped. The inspector's eyes narrowed, and he adjusted the sensitivity. The beeping became rapid, urgent. Jesus, he muttered under his breath. This line's not just live, it's leaking bad. He stood abruptly, turning to one of the younger crew members nearby. Kill all ignition sources on site. Now. No welding, no grinding, nothing. The worker blinked. Even now, the inspector barked. The mood shifted instantly. Conversations stopped. The distant whine of a saw died mid. Workers began pulling power cords and shutting down generators. Riley's face drained of color. You're telling me, I'm telling you, if you'd welded over that pipe, you'd be picking steel out of your teeth in the afterlife, the inspector said flatly. Ethan's heart pounded, not from fear now, but from a grim satisfaction. He looked at the officers, expecting them to release him. Instead, they exchanged glances. The inspector noticed. You're arresting him. For what, saving your lives? The younger officer cleared his throat. We got a call about property damage. Forget the property. That man just stopped this place from becoming a crater. Reluctantly, the older officer stepped forward, pulling a key from his belt. The handcuffs clicked open. Ethan rubbed his wrists, the cold morning air stinging the tender skin. The inspector turned back to the pipe. We'll need to shut down the whole block. That means cutting service lines, evacuating nearby businesses and homes until we can dig this out and replace it. One of the crew members swore under his breath. Another stared at the pipe like it might start hissing louder at any second. Riley muttered something about delays and costs, but the inspector cut him off with a sharp glance. You'd rather be paying for funerals. Ethan took the rock marker from his pocket and held it out. This was embedded in the slab above the pipe. The foundation shifted marker came loose. That's how I knew it wasn't secure. The inspector took it, turning it over in his hand. Old school safety marker. Haven't seen one of these in years. Good catch. He met Ethan's gaze. Not many people would have noticed this. Fewer still would have done something about it. Word spread quickly. By the time the fire department arrived to coordinate the evacuation, a small crowd of onlookers had gathered outside the taped-off perimeter. Ethan stood off to the side, watching the chaos with an odd mix of relief and exhaustion. For the first time in days, the tension in his shoulders eased. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't paranoid. He'd been right, but vindication didn't erase the reality. He'd just made an enemy out of a foreman, and likely every supervisor in Riley's chain of command. Jobs like this ran on word of mouth, and bad word traveled fast. The inspector approached again, offering a card. If you're ever looking for work, we could use someone with your eye and your stubborn streak. Ethan accepted it with a nod. I might take you up on that. Across the lot, Riley was pacing, phone to his ear, his face a storm cloud. Ethan didn't need to hear the words to know the conversation wasn't going well. The officers who had cuffed him earlier gave him a nod before heading back to their cruiser. It wasn't an apology, but it was close enough. Ethan glanced at the rock in the inspector's hand one last time. Keep it, he said. Might make a good reminder for the next guy who thinks old pipes can't cause trouble. By late afternoon, the site was a ghost town. The gas authority crew had fenced off the danger zone. The fire trucks were gone, and only the faint smell of gas lingered in the air. Ethan walked away from Riverbend's half-built complex with nothing but the clothes on his back, the card in his pocket, and the quiet knowledge that, for once, he'd been exactly where he needed to be. He didn't know where his next paycheck would come from, but he knew this: he'd rather be broke and right than rich and standing over a pile of rubble. But as he reached the corner, a siren wailed faintly in the distance, not an alarm this time, but a reminder. Trouble was never far away. The diner was nearly empty, the kind of quiet that came after the dinner rush but before the late-night crowd. A jukebox in the corner hummed softly, playing an old Otis Redding track that barely reached Ethan's booth. He sat with his back to the wall, hands wrapped around a coffee cup gone cold hours ago. Outside, the rain had turned steady, streaking the windows and turning the glow of the streetlights into shimmering halos. The bell above the door jingled, and in walked the city gas inspector, vest unzipped, his shoulders dusted with rain. He carried an envelope thick enough to bulge at the seams. Spotting Ethan, he made his way over, the soles of his boots squeaking on the tile. Mind if I sit? Ethan shrugged toward the opposite bench. You bought coffee. Too late in the day for me, but I brought you something. The inspector slid the envelope across the table. It left a faint damp streak on the Formica incident report. He said, official copy, but that's not all. Ethan tore the flap and pulled out a stapled packet. Standard city report. Time of response, readings from the gas detector, immediate actions taken, but beneath that was a folded sheet of paper with no letterhead, no date, just a string of typed lines and highlighted notes. Where'd you get this? Ethan asked. Didn't. It found me, the inspector said, leaning in. Friend in the department flagged it. That pipe you found. It wasn't the only one. There are at least 8 more, just like its old industrial mains, supposed to be decommissioned decades ago. Except they're still under pressure, still connected. Ethan's brows knit. 8 more. Where? The inspector tapped a spot near the bottom of the page. A list of addresses spanned the length of it: warehouses, old apartment buildings, even a school. Ethan skimmed the list again. These places, some of them are right in the middle of neighborhoods. If one of those goes, it won't be a single block that's gone. It'll be half a district. Ethan set the papers down, feeling the weight of them in his gut. So why the hell haven't they been fixed? The inspector's expression darkened. Budget cuts, contract disputes, and if you ask me, somebody's making money keeping it that way. You think it's corruption? I think this city has a habit of looking the other way when repairs get expensive, and I think some folks prefer the paperwork to stay buried until the problem Ethan's jaw tightened. And if it does, the official story will be tragic accident. Exactly. A waitress came by, refilled Ethan's cup without asking, and drifted away again. Neither man spoke until she was out of earshot. Ethan broke the silence. You want me to do something about this? I want someone who gives a damn to do something. My hands are tied. If I push too hard, I'm off the job. You're already off the payroll. No one's watching you. Ethan gave a humorless laugh. You make it sound like a compliment. It is. Look, the inspector glanced toward the window, scanning the rainy street outside. Whoever's sitting on this list won't take kindly to people sniffing around. But you've got something they don't. And what's that? The stubbornness to swing a sledgehammer at the truth. Ethan looked back down at the list. One address in particular caught his eye: a shuttered textile mill down by the river. He'd passed it 100 times. The building was dark, abandoned, but the surrounding blocks still buzzed with life: cafes, apartments, a daycare. What happens if I start at the top? He asked. The inspector hesitated. Then you'd better be ready for someone to notice you're looking. They talked for another 20 minutes, going over the addresses, piecing together a mental map of the danger zones. By the time the inspector stood to leave, Ethan had memorized 3 locations. The inspector placed a hand on the table. Don't try to be a hero, Ward. Heroes end up in the obituaries. Be smart. Ethan nodded but didn't promise anything. He watched the man disappear into the rain, the doorbell jingling softly in his wake. When the diner door closed, the silence pressed in again. Ethan sipped the fresh coffee, eyes drifting to the street outside. Through the rain-streaked glass, he saw a dark sedan idling across the road. The windows were tinted black, and even with the streetlights he couldn't see inside. It didn't move for the next 10 minutes. Ethan tucked the envelope back together, slid it inside his jacket, and dropped a few bills on the table. He didn't bother with the coffee. The rain felt colder than it had through the glass. The sedan's headlights flicked on as soon as he stepped onto the sidewalk. Ethan started walking, not fast enough to look suspicious, but not slow enough to make himself an easy target. The sedan rolled forward, keeping pace on the opposite side of the street. He turned down an alley lined with dumpsters and fire escapes. The car didn't follow, but when he emerged on the next block, it was there again, cruising past without stopping. By the time Ethan reached his rented room above the laundromat, his pulse was steady again, but his mind wasn't. He pulled the curtains shut, switched off the light, and sat on the edge of the bed with the list in his hands. 8 addresses, 8 chances for the city to lose more than it could ever rebuild. He'd told himself after the Riverbend site that he was done sticking his neck out. But now it felt like the choice had already been made. He unfolded a street map from his dresser drawer and started marking the addresses with a black pen. The pattern emerged almost immediately. Every location was tied to an old industrial corridor, most of them now surrounded by residential developments. Somebody had known these pipes were there when they approved the construction. Somebody had gambled that they'd stay buried and quiet. And if Ethan was reading the pattern right, the textile mill wasn't just another leak waiting to happen. It was the centerpiece of the whole mess. The sound of tires on wet asphalt drifted up from the street below. Ethan moved to the window, careful to part the curtain only an inch. The dark sedan was back, parked under the glow of a flickering street lamp. Ethan let the curtain fall back into place. He wasn't sure yet whether the people in that car were connected to the list, but he had a feeling he was about to find out. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, but the streets still gleamed, slick and dark. As Ethan made his way toward the old textile mill, the air was heavy with the damp smell of the river, and the gulls circling overhead called out like restless sentries. The mill loomed against the pale morning sky, a hulking, rectangular silhouette of brick and steel. Rows of shattered windows stared down at the empty parking lot like blind eyes. Weeds pushed through the cracked asphalt, and the faded sign above the main entrance read, Riverside Textiles, EST, 1923. Ethan parked 2 blocks away, behind a row of storage units, and approached on foot. He carried only what he could conceal. Under his jacket, a crowbar, a small flashlight, and the cheap digital camera he'd picked up at a pawnshop the night before. The list of addresses was folded in his back pocket, but this one was burned into his mind. According to the inspector's notes, the main gas line ran under the south wing of the building. The mill had been shut down for over a decade, but the pipe was still connected to the city's network, pressurized and ignored. The front entrance was padlocked and boarded over, but Ethan had no intention of going in that way. He circled around the side, boots crunching on broken glass, until he found a rusted service door hanging slightly ajar. The hinges protested with a long drawn-out squeal as he eased it open. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint, bitter tang of machine oil and mildew. Shafts of weak daylight filtered through the high windows, illuminating a vast floor littered with debris, abandoned spools, rotted wooden pallets, and the skeletal remains of machinery long since stripped for parts. Ethan moved slowly, the sound of his footsteps muffled by layers of dust and damp fabric scraps. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional drip of water from somewhere. Far above, he found the south wing by following the skeletal remains of the old conveyor belts. The floor sloped gently downward, toward a series of grated drains set into the concrete. It was colder here, the air heavy with a faint metallic smell. That was when he heard it. A hiss. It was faint, so faint he almost thought he was imagining it, but it was there. Threading through the stillness, Ethan crouched, pressing his palm to the floor. No vibration, not yet, but the sound was enough to set his teeth on edge. He traced the hiss to a corner where the concrete floor had cracked in a jagged line. Kneeling, he ran the flashlight beam over the fissure. Through the narrow gap, he caught a glimpse of metal flaking yellow paint, rust gnawing at its surface. He took out the camera and snapped a few shots, adjusting the flash to capture the detail. The photos would be grainy, but they'd be proof. That's when he saw something that didn't belong. The dust around the crack wasn't uniform. There were smudges, fresh, dark streaks where something heavy had been dragged. Nearby, a set of boot prints broke the otherwise undisturbed floor. Ethan's gut tightened. He wasn't the first one here. He followed the prints deeper into the wing, weaving between rusted machinery. They led to a stack of wooden crates shoved against a wall. One crate had been pried open, its contents spilling onto the floor. A mess of old piping segments, wrapped in oily rags. Kneeling, Ethan examined the nearest piece. It was stamped with a code that matched the city's industrial gas fittings, the same kind used in the Riverbend leak. Whoever had been here had been tampering with the gas infrastructure and covering their tracks. The realization landed heavy. Someone was actively working to hide the dangerous lines, maybe even to dismantle the visible parts while leaving the pressurized sections buried. A noise snapped him out of his thoughts. Footsteps. They were soft but steady, coming from somewhere near the far end of the wing. Ethan killed his flashlight and crouched low behind the crates, heart hammering in his chest. Through a gap between two crates, he saw a shadow move tall, deliberate, scanning the space. The man wore a dark jacket and gloves, a tool bag slung over his shoulder. In his hand was a metal pry bar, glinting in the dim light. Ethan's first thought was to stay hidden, let the guy leave. But then the man knelt by the cracked floor, pulling a small torch from his bag. He was working directly over the exposed pipe. Ethan's pulse spiked. If this guy sealed the crack or removed the visible section of pipe, the evidence would be gone. And if the inspector's theory was right, the rest of the pressurized line would remain a silent bomb waiting to go off. He weighed his options. Confronting the man could get ugly fast. But walking away meant letting someone erase the truth. The decision made itself. Ethan stepped out from behind the crates, crowbar in hand. You planning to fix that, or just hide it? The man froze, then slowly stood. His eyes were sharp, calculating. You shouldn't be here. Funny, I was about to say the same thing. The man's gaze flicked to the camera hanging from Ethan's neck. Put that down and walk away. Not gonna happen. The man sighed, as if disappointed, and dropped the pry bar. His right hand disappeared into his jacket. Ethan's muscles tensed. He didn't see a gun, but the movement was enough to close the distance. He swung the crowbar low, catching the man's shin. The stranger staggered, but didn't fall, just lashed out with a sharp elbow that caught Ethan in the ribs. The camera strap snapped as it hit the floor. The man kicked it toward the cracked pipe, the impact sending a cloud of dust into the air. They circled each other now, breaths harsh in the cold space. The man feinted left, then lunged, trying to grab the envelope of photos from Ethan's jacket. Ethan drove a shoulder into him, shoving him back against the wall of crates. The crates wobbled, one toppling to the floor with a deafening crash. Somewhere above, a flock of pigeons exploded into flight, their wings beating frantically against the rafters. The man used the distraction to bolt. Ethan gave chase, dodging debris and weaving through rusted frames. The footsteps echoed ahead of him, growing fainter, until a side door slammed open and the morning light flooded in. By the time Ethan reached the door, the man was gone, vanished into the network of alleys by the river. Ethan stood in the doorway, chest heaving, rain-slick air cooling, the sweat on his skin. He glanced down at the camera in his hand. Miraculously, it still worked. The shots he'd taken of the pipe were intact, but now he had more than proof of a leak. He had proof that someone was actively protecting the danger. Ethan kept to the sidewalk, his collar turned up against the wind coming off the river. The streets here were narrow and crooked, the kind that made you feel like you were being funneled towards something unseen. He didn't look back right away. Years of odd jobs and shady contracts had taught him that when you thought you were being followed, the worst thing you could do was confirm it too soon. Let them think you were oblivious. Let them get comfortable. But the black sedan had been in his periphery since he left the textile mill. Same model, same tinted windows, same slow, deliberate pace. He turned left onto a busier street, letting the flow of pedestrians swallow him up. The mid-morning traffic was steady, the honk of car horns blending with the hiss of brakes and the rumble of delivery trucks. Ethan stopped at a corner newsstand, pretending to scan the headlines while he angled his head toward the reflection in the glass display. There it was, 20 yards back, half pulled into a loading zone, idling. The driver's face was lost in shadow, but he could see the faint glow of a phone screen inside. Ethan folded a newspaper under his arm and started walking again, this time ducking into an alley that cut behind a row of discount shops. The alley was slick with last night's rain, smelling faintly of garbage and fryer oil from a nearby diner. Halfway down, he quickened his pace. At the far end, he slipped into a narrow passage between two brick buildings, emerging onto a side street lined with old warehouses. He risked a glance back. The sedan had turned into the alley. He couldn't outrun a car. Forever not in these streets, but he could make himself harder to track. He cut diagonally across the street, toward a cluster of market stalls. Vendors were unloading boxes of produce, their shouts in Spanish and Vietnamese filling the air. Ethan wove through them, offering quick apologies when he bumped a shoulder or brushed past a crate of melons. At the far end of the market, He spotted an entrance to the old subway system, one of the disused service access points, its gate hanging open. He slipped inside, descending a flight of concrete steps into the dim, cool air below. The underground passage smelled of rust and damp concrete. Water dripped somewhere ahead, echoing off the tiled walls. Ethan clicked on his small flashlight and moved quickly, following the faded exit signs until he reached a service tunnel that branched away from the main corridor. He needed to stash the evidence, the camera with the mill photos, somewhere. It wouldn't be found if they caught up to him. The tunnel ended at a locked utility cage. He wedged the crowbar into the padlock and popped it open with a grunt. Inside was a stack of rusted toolboxes, a coil of cable, and an old maintenance logbook. He wrapped the camera in a rag, shoved it deep inside one of the toolboxes, and closed the lid. If he made it out, he could come back for it. If not, well, at least it wouldn't end up in their hands. He retraced his steps toward the subway stairs, but the sound of footsteps stopped him cold. Slow, measured, coming from the direction of the exit. Ethan's pulse climbed. He ducked behind a support pillar, killing the flashlight. The dim light from the stairwell silhouetted two figures as they descended, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other leaner, but moving with the easy confidence of someone who'd done this before. They reached the bottom of the stairs and paused. One of them pulled out a small flashlight, its beam slicing through the gloom. Ethan eased farther into the shadows, his back against the cold tile. The taller man spoke, his voice low but carrying. "He's down here." The car followed him too. "The market, no way he got past us." The leaner one replied, "Check the tunnels. If we find the camera, we don't need him." Ethan gritted his teeth. If they started searching the utility cage, the whole game was over. He needed to draw them away. He picked up a small chunk of concrete from the floor and lobbed it down the far end of the tunnel. It clattered loudly, the sound bouncing off the walls. Both flashlights swung in that direction. The taller man muttered something and started toward the noise. The leaner one stayed put, scanning the area like he knew better than to chase the first distraction. Ethan's window was shrinking, stepped silently toward the stairwell, keeping low. The leaner man turned just enough for their eyes to meet. "Hey," the man barked. Ethan lunged, ramming a shoulder into his midsection. They crashed into the wall, the man's flashlight spinning away. The taller one shouted and came running back. Ethan broke free and sprinted up the stairs, boots pounding on the concrete. He burst into daylight, the market noise washing over him again. People turned to stare as he pushed through the crowd, his chest burning. He didn't look back until he reached the far side of the market. The black sedan was gone. No sign of the two men, either. Ethan ducked into a narrow cafe and slid into a booth near the back. His breathing slowed, but the knot in his gut stayed tight. They'd been close to close. The camera was safe for now, hidden in the toolbox. But whoever those men were, they wouldn't stop. He stirred a cup of coffee. He didn't remember ordering, the spoon clinking softly against the ceramics. His mind replayed the details. The mill, the cracked floor, the stranger with the pry bar, the men in the sedan. The list in his back pocket suddenly felt heavier. 8 addresses, 8 opportunities for someone to erase the truth before it saw daylight. He couldn't hit them all, not alone, not with shadows on his heels. He needed help. His thoughts landed on the gas inspector. The man had risked his job to hand over the envelope, to point Ethan toward the danger. Maybe he'd know someone who could protect the evidence long enough to act on it. Ethan finished the coffee, paid in cash, and left through the cafe's back door. The alley behind was empty, except for a pair of trash bins and the lingering smell of roasted beans. He headed for the subway entrance 2 blocks over the public one this time. The hidden camera wasn't going anywhere, but he could feel the clock ticking louder with each step. By the time he reached the inspector's office, the rain had started again, steady and cold. He stepped inside, shaking the water from his jacket. The receptionist looked up. "He's not here, out on a call." Ethan hesitated. "You know where?" She shook her head. "Didn't say." He left a note short, urgent, and slipped it under the inspector's office door. Then he turned back into the rain, heading for the nearest subway stop. There was still one more address he could check before nightfall, and if the men in the sedan wanted to follow, maybe he could turn the hunt around. The rain followed Ethan underground, dripping from his jacket as he stood in the rattling subway car. The dim interior lights flickered every time the train hit a curve, and the faces around him blurred in the glass reflection of the window. The folded sheet of addresses felt like a hot coal in his pocket. He pulled it out, scanning the list again. His eyes caught on the 5th entry, Maddox Street Elementary. That one hit different. He could picture the building clearly. A red brick school wedged between a laundromat and a discount grocery store. Kids spilling out in bright jackets during recess. If the inspector's notes were right, there was an old industrial line running directly under the east wing, the wing where the cafeteria and boiler room were located. He thought about what the gas detector had read at Riverbend. He thought about the faces of the men in the subway tunnel, the cold precision in their search. If the leak here was real, those kids were sitting on top of a live bomb. By the time the train reached Maddox Street, The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the air smelling faintly of wet concrete and exhaust fumes. Ethan pulled his hood up and kept his head down as he walked the 3 blocks to the school. The building looked ordinary from the outside, a bit worn, but tidy. A mural of cartoon animals stretched across the playground wall. The faint hum of laughter and voices floated from an open window on the 2nd floor. Ethan's first thought was to head straight to the principal, but the memory of Riley's dismissal at Riverbend stopped him. If the school didn't already know about the pipe, and if someone in the city wanted it buried, he could be shut out before he got close. He'd need proof first. Circling around to the back lot, he spotted a pair of metal doors marked maintenance. They were locked, but the chain was old and loose enough for him to wedge his crowbar in and snap it with a quick twist. He slipped inside, pulling the doors shut behind him. The smell hit him first: damp, dust, and the faint chemical temps of cleaning supplies. A single fluorescent tube buzzed overhead, flickering weakly. Pipes ran along the walls, most of them newer replacements, but some sections were ancient, thick steel coated in peeling yellow paint. He followed the older line toward the far wall, where the floor sloped down into a narrow crawl space. He had to get on his hands and knees to fit inside, the concrete cold against his palms. Halfway in, he heard it. That same hiss. He froze, letting his ears adjust. It was coming from directly ahead, where the yellow-painted pipe disappeared into a brick wall. The joints were rusted, the sealant cracked like old paint. A faint vibration hummed through the metal when he laid his hand on it. The air smelled faintly sweet, too faint for anyone walking by to notice, but enough to make his chest tighten. He pulled the camera from his jacket and started snapping pictures, making sure to get close-ups of the corroded joints and the city inspection tag hanging half loose from the line. The tag was dated 15 years ago. A sound from above made him pause. The slam of a door, footsteps in the maintenance hall, heavy, deliberate. Ethan killed the camera's flash and backed out of the crawl space, staying low. Through the gap in the doors, he saw a man step into the room. Not a janitor. The guy was mid-40s, lean, wearing a city utilities jacket that looked a little too new. He moved straight to the far wall, running a hand over the yellow pipe like he was checking it for weakness. Ethan ducked behind a set of shelving, heart pounding. The man reached into his jacket and pulled out a wrench, starting to loosen one of the joints. Not to fix it. Ethan could see the way he was stripping the inspection tag, wiping the joint with a rag, making it look cleaner than it was, erasing the signs of corrosion. Ethan knew he had a choice. If he stayed hidden, the man would finish his work and leave, taking with him the evidence of how bad this leak really was. But if Ethan confronted him now, he'd be exposed and judging by the tunnel. These guys weren't afraid to get their hands dirty. The decision came fast. He stepped out from behind the shelf. "You don't work here, do you?" The man turned, surprise flashing in his eyes before it hardened into something colder. "Walk away. Not while you're scrubbing a time bomb under a school full of kids." The man didn't answer. He just dropped the rag and reached into his jacket. Ethan tensed, ready for a weapon, but instead, the man pulled out a small radio. "We've got company," he said into it. Ethan lunged, knocking the radio from his hand. It clattered across the floor as they slammed into the wall, the wrench skidding away. The man swung first, catching Ethan across the cheek, but Ethan drove forward, shoving him into the shelving. A box of cleaning bottles crashed to the floor, the sharp scent of bleach filling the air. The man twisted, breaking free, and bolted for the door. Ethan chased him into the back lot, where the drizzle had thickened into rain again. That was when Ethan saw it parked across the street, headlights off. Was the same black sedan from the subway. The passenger door opened, and another man stepped out, the tall one from the tunnels. His expression didn't change as he started toward Ethan, slow and steady. The first man sprinted across the lot, yanking the sedan's back door open. "He's got pictures," he shouted. Ethan didn't wait. He turned and ran, vaulting the chain-link fence at the edge of the playground. His boots hit wet grass, then the cracked asphalt of the alley beyond. Behind him, the sound of footsteps splashed through puddles. He cut through the alley, turned sharply onto Maddox Street, and ducked into the first open door. He saw a bodega that smelled of fried food and damp cardboard. The bell above the door jingled, and the man behind the counter glanced up but didn't say a word. Ethan moved quickly to the back, pushing open the door to the stockroom. There was another exit there, leading to the opposite alley. He slipped out, keeping low, and ran until the school was several blocks behind him. When he finally stopped, lungs burning, he leaned against a graffiti-covered wall and pulled the camera from his jacket. The images were still there, the rust, the cracks, the outdated inspection tag, proof that the leak under the school was real. But now the black sedan knew exactly what he had. The rain hadn't stopped in 48 hours. It rolled in sheets down the brick walls of Riverbend's warehouse district, hissing as it met the steam curling from manhole covers. Ethan Cole's boots slapped against the slick pavement as he cut across an alley, his jacket plastered to his back. He wasn't running yet, not full tilt, but every muscle in him was wound tight, ready to snap into motion if the shadows behind him moved. He had one goal now: get the last piece of evidence to someone who could actually stop this. Everything else, his name, his freedom, his safety, could burn. Tucked inside the waterproof bag, strapped under his jacket, was the rock. The same jagged, dusty stone he had pulled from a construction site weeks earlier. The one everyone laughed at him for keeping, but inside that stone was the truth. Literally, when he'd cracked part of it open in his small basement workshop, he found it wasn't just a chunk of concrete rubble. It was a hollowed shell, filled with a metallic capsule etched with a series of numbers. Coordinates, and not just any coordinates, they lined up perfectly with the underground gas main running beneath Maddox Street Elementary. Now, he knew why the fake utility crew had been everywhere lately. They weren't fixing pipes, they were sabotaging them. The contact his destination loomed ahead. The Rusted Lantern, a dive bar wedged between a boarded-up pawn shop and a closed bail bonds office. Inside was Frank Dillardin, investigative reporter who owed Ethan a favor from years back. If anyone could blow this open before the sabotage was complete, it was Frank. Ethan pushed through the door, the stale air inside smelling of beer, cigarette smoke, and damp wool coats. Frank was already there in a corner booth, tapping on a battered laptop. His thinning hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and the glow from the screen made the deep lines on his face sharper. "You look like hell," Frank said without looking up. "I need you to see something," Ethan replied, sliding into the booth. He pulled the rock from the bag, setting it down on the table like a talisman. "What I'm about to show you can't leave this room, not until you know how to use it." Frank raised an eyebrow, leaning in as Ethan twisted the stone apart. To reveal the metallic capsule inside, the numbers glinted under the yellow bulb above them. "What is that?" Frank asked. "Coordinates," Ethan said. "For a section of gas main under the school. Someone's rigging it to blow. And the people doing it, they've got city clearance, fake work orders, the whole thing." Frank swore under his breath. "You've got proof." "This and more," Ethan said. "But they know I've got it. I've been chased, set up," and he stopped when he noticed the figure standing near the bar, pretending to watch the muted television. Tall, broad-shouldered, black leather gloves. The same man Ethan had seen in the school's maintenance room 3 nights ago. The interruption. Ethan leaned in close to Frank. "You need to go. Now use the back door. Take the rock and get to your editor." "What about you?" Frank asked. "I'll lead him away. Just move." Before Frank could protest, Ethan slid the rock across the table into his hands and stood up, heading toward the front exit as if he hadn't noticed the watcher. The man at the bar waited 2 beats before following. The moment Ethan stepped outside, the cold night air cut through his damp clothes. He moved quickly down the sidewalk, listening for the echo of footsteps behind him. They came steady, unhurried. This guy wasn't just tracking him, he was hurting him. Ethan turned down an alley, then another, weaving through the back streets until he reached the skeletal frame of an unfinished high-rise. He ducked inside, his boots crunching over broken glass and scattered nails. The confrontation. The man stepped in a moment later, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate strides. "You've been making a lot of trouble," the man said, his voice low but carrying in the hollow space. "I'm just making sure kids don't end up dead because some rich bastard wants to cash in on insurance fraud," Ethan shot back. The man smiled faintly, pulling a slim metal cylinder from his jacket pocket. "You think you understand the scale of this pick? It's bigger than your little moral stand." Ethan's eyes flicked to the cylinder. "That a detonator?" The man didn't answer. He didn't need to. The implication hung in the air like the smell of wet concrete. "You've got 2 choices," the man continued. "Walk away now, disappear, and you might see another sunrise. Or keep playing hero, and I'll make sure the last thing you hear is the sound of your own bones breaking." Ethan's pulse thudded in his ears. He thought of the kids at Maddox Street Elementary, the families who lived in the block radius, the teachers who stayed late grading papers. Then he thought of his own name already dragged through the mud from the sabotage charge. They'd pinned on him. No one was coming to save him. Not unless he finished this. The opening. A distant siren wailed somewhere in the city. The man turned his head just slightly, listening. It was enough. Ethan grabbed a length of rebar from the ground and swung. The man dodged, but the metal glanced off his shoulder, making him stumble. The cylinder clattered to the floor. Ethan dove for it, but the man was faster than he looked. They crashed into each other, grappling, boots skidding on the debris-strewn concrete. The fight was ugly. Style, no rules. Just 2 men trying to break each other apart in the dark. Ethan took a fist to the jaw that rattled his teeth, but he drove his knee into the man's ribs in return. Hearing a satisfying grunt. In the chaos, Ethan's hand closed over the cylinder. He jammed it into his jacket pocket and rolled away, scrambling toward the nearest exit. The pursuit. The man came after him immediately. Ethan tore down the skeletal stairwell, his boots slamming against the metal steps, the sound echoing through the empty highway. He burst out into the rain, the wind cutting sideways across the street. A black sedan roared around the corner, its headlights locking onto him like a predator's eyes. He sprinted toward the nearest cross street, lungs burning, the sound of tires splashing through puddles at his back. The narrow escape just before the sedan could close the gap. Ethan dove between two dumpsters into a narrow service alley, vanishing into the shadows. The sedan screeched to a halt, unable to follow, and a car door slammed. Footsteps pounded the wet pavement behind him. He didn't stop until he reached the riverfront, where the old pedestrian bridge crossed into the quieter part of town. The rain was falling harder now, blurring the streetlights into smeared halos. Ethan slowed, breath ragged, checking his pocket. The cylinder was still there, warm from his grip. Whatever was inside could be the final piece Frank needed to prove everything. But Frank wasn't safe yet. Neither was anyone else. Rain hammered the steel beams above, turning the half-built highrise into a cathedral of echoes. Ethan's breath came in measured bursts, his knuckles wide around the length of rusted rebar. Across the skeletal concrete floor, Marcus, man behind the detonator, stood motionless, rain streaking down his face like black ink under the dim work lights. "You're too late," Marcus said, his voice carrying in the cavernous space. "The charge is set. Gas line goes, the whole block's gone, before anyone even smells it." Ethan glanced past him toward the open side of the structure. Down on the street, 2 blocks away, families were still in their homes. Kids sleeping, TVs flickering behind rain-streaked windows. Somewhere among them was the Little League field where he had poured concrete last summer, the one where he'd promised the kids he'd come watch a game once the season started. "That's not happening," Ethan said, stepping forward. The rebar scraped against the floor. Marcus tilted his head. "You think you can stop it? You're just a laborer who got in the way." "I'm the one who found your work," Ethan said, voice low but steady. "And I'm the one who's gonna end it." The two men circled slowly, boots sloshing through puddles collected in the uneven concrete. Ethan's eyes darted to the small steel detonator in Marcus's grip. It was linked to a set of charges wired along the maintenance tunnel under Maddox Street Elementary, charges Ethan had found while pretending to fix a leaking pipe. Charges he had disabled except for one. Marcus smirked, reading Ethan's hesitation. "You don't even know if the last ones live, do you?" He lifted the detonator slightly. "Want to gamble?" The truth was, Ethan had gambled. In the scramble to get here, he'd ripped out the fuses from most of the charges, but one had been wedged behind a rusted valve. He'd had seconds before the tunnel patrol came back, so he'd stuffed something else in its place. The jagged gray stone he'd kept in his jacket pocket for months. It wasn't just any stone, it was from his father's demolished workshop, the one place that had taught him what it meant to build something worth keeping. He'd picked it up the day the wrecking crew knocked the walls down, telling himself it would remind him not to let something good be destroyed without a fight. That stone was now sitting in place of the last charge, a silent stand-in for a catastrophe. That would never happen if Marcus didn't realize it in time. A crack of thunder rolled through the open girders, rattling the air between them. Marcus moved first, lunging forward with surprising speed. Ethan sidestepped, bringing the rebar up to deflect Marcus's swing. The detonator clattered once against the floor before Marcus snatched it back, cursing. "You're fast for someone who hauls cement all day," Marcus snarled. "Guess all those double shifts paid off." Ethan shot back, his voice edged with grim humor. The fight grew desperate. Marcus swung wide, trying to create space, but Ethan pressed forward, every step fueled by months of frustration, injustice, and the memory of the cop shoving him into a cruiser while calling him a saboteur. Rainwater dripped into his eyes, blurring his vision, but he didn't slow. Marcus tried for another feint, stepping toward the edge of the open wall as if to jump down a level. Ethan saw the move, closed the gap, and wrenched Marcus's arm. The detonator skittered across the wet concrete, stopping near a pile of rebar. Both men dove for it. Ethan's fingers brushed the cold metal first. He rolled, clutching it to his chest as Marcus's fists pounded his ribs. The breath left him in a sharp gasp, but his grip held with his free hand. He swung the rebar hard, catching Marcus in the shoulder. The man staggered, rage flashing across his face. "You don't even know what you're stopping," Marcus spat, clutching his shoulder. "Do you think this city cares about people like you? The ones who get buried in scaffolding accidents while the developers toast champagne. I'm doing them a favor, wiping it clean so someone can start over." "Starting over doesn't mean burning it down," Ethan said. His voice was a growl, each word heavy. They stared at each other across the wet floor, the city lights flickering. Through the rain beyond, Ethan could feel his heartbeat pounding in his ears, the cold weight of the detonator in his palm. He tightened his grip hand, snapped it in two. Marcus froze, staring at the broken device. The faint red LED blinked once, then died. "No." Marcus lunged, but Ethan met him with a full shoulder slam, driving him backward into the steel support beam. The man crumpled, the fight gone from him. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Ethan stepped back, catching his breath. His ribs ached, his knuckles throbbed, but relief began to seep in like warm light after a long night. He turned toward the edge of the high-rise, looking out over the soaked streets. Emergency lights splashed blue and red across the rain-slick asphalt as police cars and fire trucks converged on the block. Somewhere down there, people were still sleeping, unaware that their homes had nearly become rubble, and in the maintenance tunnel, behind a rusted valve, a single gray stone sat quietly where a bomb was supposed to be holding the weight of what might have been. Minutes later, officers swarmed the upper levels. Detective Harris, the one who'd arrested him months ago, approached with a wary look. "Cole," Harris said, eyeing Marcus being hauled away in cuffs. "Looks like I owe you a few apologies." Ethan just nodded. Words weren't going to fix the hours in holding cells, the weeks of whispered accusations on job sites, or the quiet shame in his mother's eyes. But maybe, just maybe, they'd stop calling him a criminal. As Harris started taking his statement, a voice called from behind. It was Mrs. Landry, the elderly woman who ran the deli on Maddox Street. She'd found her way past the barricade. Clutching a soaked umbrella, "They said you stopped something bad tonight," she said, her eyes shining. "That true?" Ethan shrugged, glancing at the stone still in his pocket. "Guess I just kept something in place." By dawn, the storm had passed. The high-rise skeleton stood against a pale sky, its unfinished beams catching the first light. Ethan walked the block slowly, his boots leaving dark prints on the wet pavement. He could hear kids laughing in the distance, the sound carrying over the still damp streets. He stopped at the chain-link fence around the Little League field, the one he'd helped pour concrete for. It was empty now, puddles collecting in the infield. But in a few days, it would be filled again, parents cheering, kids running bases. Ethan reached into his jacket, pulling out the gray stone. He set it on the corner of the dugout, a silent marker for what he'd carried and what he'd let go. "Stay put," he murmured, almost smiling. Then he turned, the city stretching out before him, and walked toward whatever came next. This time, not as a man accused but as the one who held the line.